There is a man dragging a body through the dust. He is doing it behind a chariot. The horses move at a steady pace. Not fast, not slow. The way horses move when they have been doing something long enough that it requires no urging. The body behind them leaves a long mark in the dirt, straight where the road is straight, curved where the chariot curves. On the walls above, people are watching. An old man, a woman beside him, a child somewhere behind them who keeps trying to look and keeps being pulled back by someone who does not want the child to see. The old man does not look away. He has been standing on this wall long enough that his legs should hurt. Probably they do. He is standing there anyway because the body in the dust is his son, and he cannot make himself stop looking. The man driving the chariot is young. He does not look back at what he is dragging. He looks straight ahead at nothing. He has been doing this for days. This is what the greatest warrior in the world looked like on the day he won, nearly 20 years earlier. A beach in Thessaly, a mother and her son. The water off the Thessalian coast comes in cold, even in summer, hitting the shore without ceremony. On this particular afternoon, a boy of about 9 sat at the edge where dry sand becomes wet sand, close enough that each wave touched his feet and pulled back. His mother sat behind him. She was not the kind of woman you forgot after meeting. There was something about her that made the air feel different, the way it feels before a storm. Not threatening, but changed. She had been watching her son for a long time before she spoke. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen all the way to the end before you say anything." He turned around. She had his full attention. He was that kind of child. She told him there were 2 paths. She said, "You can live a long life. You will grow old in Phthia. You will have children and watch them grow, and one day you will die in a bed surrounded by people who love you. And within a generation or 2, almost no one will remember your name." The water came in, pulled back. "Or," she said, "you can go to war. You will not come home. You will die young on foreign ground, far from everything you know. But every generation that comes after you, all the way to the last one that ever lives on this earth, will know your name." She stopped. She was watching him the way mothers watch their children when they already know the answer, but are hoping they are wrong. The boy looked back at the water. He sat with it for a while. The water came in and pulled back 3 more times. Then he said, "Tell me about the war." She knew in that moment, not because of what he said, because of the way he asked. There was no weight in it, no sense that he understood what he was choosing. He asked about the war the way a child asks about something exciting happening somewhere else and wants to know if he can go. That was the moment she began to lose him. Not to Troy, not to any arrow. She began to lose him to his own nature on a beach in Thessaly. On an afternoon, when the water came in cold, and a boy looked at the ocean and could not see anything in it that frightened him. The story of Achilles comes from more than one place. The Iliad, the great poem attributed to Homer, gives us the heart of it. 10 years of war, a quarrel, a death, and a grief so large it reshaped everything it touched. But Achilles lived beyond what Homer chose to tell. His childhood, his training, the story of his heel, the manner of his death. These come from other traditions that carried his story forward when the poem stopped. This story draws from all of them. It will say so when it does. He had been at Troy for 10 years. He had not yet lost anything that mattered. 10 years is a long time to be anywhere. 10 years on the same stretch of shore, looking at the same walls. The men who had arrived as young soldiers were not young anymore. They had lines around their eyes from squinting into the same Aegean sun for a decade. They knew which parts of the camp flooded when it rained and which stayed dry. They had stopped talking about home the way they talked about it in the first year, with longing and the specific ache of someone who expects to return soon. Now when they talked about home, it was briefer, flatter, like describing a place you visited once a long time ago and are no longer sure you remember correctly. This is what 10 years of war looks like from the inside. Not glory. Mud in the rainy season. Heat in the summer that made the armor unbearable by mid-morning. The low-grade boredom of days when nothing happened, and the sharp animal fear of days when everything happened at once. And then there was Achilles, a soldier named Meleager, who had been at Troy since the 2nd year and survived things that should have killed him twice over. They was explaining this to a new arrival one morning while they waited for the cooking fires to get going. The new arrival was from a small town in Phocis and had never been more than 30 miles from where he was born until 3 weeks ago. Meleager said, "There are thousands of men on this beach. Some of them are excellent soldiers. Some are adequate. Some are going to get somebody killed through sheer stupidity, and we all know who they are. And then there is Achilles." The new arrival said, "What makes him different?" Meleager thought about this for a moment. He was not a man who liked to say things imprecisely. He said, "When Achilles fights, we win. When he does not fight, we survive. That is the difference. Every plan Agamemnon draws up, every decision about when to push and when to hold, all of it starts from one question. Where is Achilles and what is he doing? He is not a soldier. He is the thing the rest of us are arranged around." The new arrival said, "What does he look like?" Meleager poured himself a cup of water and drank half of it. He said, like the only person in the room who has never once wondered whether he might lose. Across the camp, maybe 300 yards from where this conversation was happening, Achilles was running. Not training runs. Not the careful, measured exercise of a man maintaining condition. Running the way he had run since he was a child. Fast and long and without apparent effort. Like the body was doing what it was built for and found the whole thing easy, in a way that made other men tired just watching. Patroclus was sitting outside their tent, eating a piece of bread with the unhurried ease of a man who had watched this specific sight so many times it had become comfortable furniture. The morning smelled like salt and cooked smoke. Gulls were working the shoreline. Somewhere toward the center of camp, someone was already arguing about something, the tone of a disagreement that had been going on for a while and was not close to resolution. It was a morning, like most mornings here, until it was time to fight. Then it was different. The engagement that day was not a major one. A sortie from the Trojan side, testing the eastern edge of the Greek line, probing for weakness the way the Trojans had been doing periodically for years, the kind of skirmish that had its own rhythm by now, both sides knowing roughly how it would go. Then Achilles arrived. There is a quality certain people have in a room, or, in this case, on a field, where their presence changes the weight of everything else, not because of what they do immediately, but because of what everyone knows they are capable of. The Trojan line, advancing with disciplined confidence, did something the moment they saw him that was not quite stopping and not quite retreating. A hesitation, a collective recalibration. Every man on that side doing the same arithmetic: how far are we from him and in which direction is away? Achilles fought the way a storm moves through a valley. No wasted motion, no flourish, no performance. He fought like a man for whom this was simply what his body did when it was time to do it. Accurate and efficient and completely without doubt. When it was over, the Trojans had pulled back to the walls. The Greeks had held the line with room to spare. The men around Achilles were flushed with the relief of people who have been afraid and come through the other side. Achilles was breathing normally. He looked up at the walls. On the ramparts, a figure was standing and looking down, tall, broad in the shoulders, wearing armor that caught the afternoon light. He was not retreating with the others. He was standing at the wall's edge, looking at the field below, with the focused attention of a man studying something carefully. Achilles looked at him. The figure on the wall looked back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then the figure turned and walked back into the city, The gates of Troy closed behind him. Meleager, standing nearby, said nothing. He had been at Troy long enough to know that exchange meant something. Two men on opposite sides of a wall, taking the measure of each other across a distance neither of them had crossed yet. He also knew, in the way soldiers who have survived long enough develop an instinct for these things, that whatever that moment was, it was not finished. It was the beginning of something, the kind of beginning that looks quiet and turns out to have been the start of everything. Troy had been standing for 10 years. Achilles had been winning for 10 years. Neither fact seemed to change the other. The night after a skirmish was always quieter than the night before one. Men sat around fires longer than they needed to. Conversations moved slower. People laughed at things that were not that funny because the laughter felt good and they had earned it. Achilles did not sit around fires on nights like these. He sat outside his tent alone, away from the light, looking at the water. Patroclus had learned years ago to leave him to it, not because Achilles was unreachable in those moments, but because he was somewhere else in his head. And the somewhere else was a place he went alone. What he was doing, though he would not have called it this, was remembering. There was a mountain in Thessaly called Pelion. On that mountain there lived a creature who was, depending on how you told the story, either a man who was half horse or something that had never been fully one thing or the other and had long since made peace with that. His name was Chiron. He was very old. He had taught a considerable number of people who went on to become the kind of person that other people told stories about. He was not impressed by this. He was impressed by very little, which was one of the things that made him a good teacher. Achilles had been sent to him at 6 years old. The first thing Chiron did when Peleus brought the boy to the mountain was look at him for a long time without saying anything. Achilles stared back with the direct gaze of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude. Chiron said, "Does he always look at people like that?" Peleus said, "Always." Chiron said, "Good. What should I know about him?" Peleus said, "He is faster than children his age by a margin I cannot explain. He learns physical things the first time he is shown them. He does not back down from anything." Chiron said, "What frightens him?" A pause. Peleus said, "I have not found it yet." Chiron looked at the boy again. The boy was still looking back, patient and direct and completely unintimidated by a creature that made most grown men nervous. Chiron said, "That is either very good or very bad. Probably both. Leave him here." What people remembered about Chiron's teaching was the fighting, the spear work, the sword work. These things were real, and Achilles absorbed all of it with the terrifying ease of someone doing what he was born to do. But Chiron taught other things too. He taught Achilles to play the lyre, not as decoration, not as a break from serious work, but as something he considered equally serious. He said once, "The men who only know how to destroy things are dangerous to everyone, including themselves. You will learn both. You will be better at one of them. You will need both." He taught him medicine, how to clean a wound, how to close it, what plants could be used for fever and which for pain. He said, "You will spend your life on battlefields. The men around you will need someone who knows how to keep them alive. You will know how." He taught him to hunt. Real hunting requires patience, stillness, the ability to wait for the right moment without forcing it. It was the only discipline Achilles found genuinely difficult. He was not built for waiting. Chiron knew this and taught it anyway. He said, "The things hardest for you are the most important to learn." Achilles said, "Why?" Chiron said, "Because your gifts will take you very far. Your weaknesses will decide what happens when you get there." There was one afternoon late in his time on the mountain when Chiron asked him a question he remembered ever after. They had been practicing spear work and had stopped to rest and Chiron had been quiet for a while, with the quality of quiet that meant he was about to say something that required the quiet first. He asked, "How do you want to be remembered?" Achilles answered, without thinking. He said what he had said to his mother on the beach, what he had said to himself. Every time the question came up, he wanted to be remembered as the greatest warrior who ever lived. He wanted a name that lasted. He wanted the kind of fame that did not diminish with distance or time. Chiron was quiet for a moment after this. Then he said, "I notice you answered that without pausing." Achilles said, "I have thought about it a lot." Chiron said, "I know. That is not what I mean. I mean that you answered it the way people answer questions when they have already made the decision and are no longer really considering. Just reporting." He looked at Achilles steadily. The people who answer that question the fastest usually pay the highest price for the answer. Achilles said, "You think the price is too high?" Chiron said, "I think you do not yet know what the price is." Which is different. They went back to the spear work. The afternoon closed down around the mountain, and the light went golden in the trees, and Achilles moved through the forms with the fluid precision that had by now become simply the way he moved through everything. Chiron watched him. He had taught a great many people over a very long life. He knew what this particular kind of greatness cost. He had seen it before. He had watched it move through people who had everything and could not stop reaching for more. This is the part of his story that Homer does not linger on. Later, traditions filled it in. And what they gave us is a childhood that makes everything after it make sense. The one thing Chiron could not teach him was hesitation. He tried. It did not take. The sea off Thessaly ran deep and cold, even in summer. Thetis lived at the bottom of it. Most people imagined that as something peaceful, something removed from the noise and damage of the world above the surface. They were not entirely wrong. There was a quality to deep water, the specific silence of it, the way light moved slower and softer down there. That was genuinely removed from things. But removed was not the same as unaware. She knew everything that happened to her son, not the way a person reads a letter or receives a messenger. She knew it the way you know when the weather is changing before the clouds arrive. Something in the pressure of things shifting before she could have said, why? When Achilles was sick as a child, she felt it before any servant came to tell her. When he was afraid, which was rare, she felt that too. She had felt what was coming for a long time. When the war began, and the ships were being gathered, and the Greek alliance was grinding into motion, Thetis did something that later traditions remembered clearly. She took Achilles to the island of Skyros. She made arrangements with Lycomedes, the king there, to keep her son among his daughters, disguised, hidden from the men, going to every corner of the Greek world, looking for warriors. This part of his story does not appear in the Iliad. It comes from later traditions outside of Homer, whether it happened exactly this way or not. It tells us one true thing. Thetis had already accepted that she could not stop what was coming through argument or appeal. She had tried those. She was now trying concealment. The problem with concealment is that it requires the person being concealed to cooperate. Achilles was 17. He cooperated because his mother asked him to, and he loved her. But there was a quality to his cooperation that she noticed and tried not to look at directly. He was patient in the palace, the way a river is patient when something is blocking its path. The pressure was there. The waiting could not relieve it. It was Odysseus who came to Skyros. He came as a merchant, with a cart of goods to trade, bolts of fine cloth, jewelry, the things a palace of women might want. He laid these out in the courtyard and let people come and look. Among the goods, set to one side as if included by accident, were weapons, a spear, a short sword, a shield, plain and functional. The daughters of Lycomedes moved through the cloth and jewelry with the practiced interest of young women who know what they like. Then one of them stopped at the weapons, reached out and touched the spear shaft, lifted it slightly, testing the weight. Odysseus watched from across the courtyard. The way she lifted it was not the way someone picks up an unfamiliar object. The hand found the right place automatically. The balance was assessed in half a second. The posture shifted the small ways a body shifts when it recognizes what it is holding. He walked across the courtyard and stood beside her. He said, quietly, "We need you." Achilles looked at him. Not the look of someone caught in a deception and afraid. The look of someone who had been waiting for a particular knock on a particular door and had just heard it. He said, "I know. Thetis was not there when this happened. She felt it anyway. The current moving in a direction she had tried to redirect and could not. She was deep in the water off Thessaly when her son picked up a spear in a courtyard on Skyros and said 2 words that ended every plan she had made. She did not surface for a long time. Later, when Achilles was already at Troy and the war had been running for years, she came whenever he called. She always came. This was not a choice she made each time. It was simply what she was. She carried with her, on every visit, the knowledge of how it ended. She had known since before he was born, and she had held that knowledge through every conversation, every visit, every moment of watching him from the water. And she had not told him. She had not told him because telling him would not have changed what he chose. She had understood that since Skyros, a goddess watched her son pick up a sword he did not have to pick up. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say that he would have heard. The city woke up before the sun. Bakers first, then the merchants, then everybody else. The whole organism of a city coming online in its natural sequence. Troy was very old. Its walls had been built and reinforced and built again over generations until they were less like construction and more like geology, something that had grown from the ground rather than been placed on it. Inside those walls, tens of thousands of people went about the ordinary business of being alive, cooking, trading, raising children, repairing roofs, forgetting things they meant to remember. There was also the war, but the war was outside the walls. Inside was still, mostly, a city. Hector woke before his wife. He did this every morning, not from discipline, but because his body had decided on this schedule years ago and maintained it, regardless of what he thought about it. He lay still for a moment after waking and listened to the sounds of the palace and the city beyond it. Andromache was asleep beside him. He could hear her breathing. In the next room, quieter, was Astyanax. The boy was 3 years old and had recently discovered that the period after adults thought he was asleep was full of interesting possibilities. This morning the silence was genuine. Hector got up and dressed in the dark. Quietly, with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done this without waking anyone for years. He went out onto the terrace that looked over the lower city and stood there while the sky went from black to deep blue to the grey that comes just before colour returns to the world. He thought about the day. Not strategy, not troop dispositions. What he thought about in this first quiet hour was simpler and harder, what needed doing today, and what was the right way to do it. He was the best soldier Troy had. He had not chosen this. It had been established over years of fighting the way things get established when the evidence accumulates past the point where anyone argues with it. When the Trojans needed someone to hold a line or break one, when a decision needed to be made on the field in the space of a breath, they looked for Hector. He carried this the way he carried everything, without complaint, without apparent weight, as if it was simply the shape of his life, and there was nothing to be done about the shape of your life except to live it as well as you could. The sky was lightening over the Aegean. He could see the Greek camp from here, the outermost fires burning low. 10 years. He had been fighting these men for 10 years and knew some of their patterns better than they probably knew themselves. He heard Andromache before he saw her. She came and stood beside him and did not say anything for a while. This was something he loved about her, the ability to share silence without filling it. She said eventually, Astyanax asked about you last night, after you were already asleep. He wanted to know what you were dreaming. Hector said, what did you tell him? She said, I told him you were probably dreaming about horses because you always seemed happy when you talked about horses. He almost smiled. He said, that was good. She said, he is afraid of your helmet. He said, I know. She said, he will not say so. He pretends he is not. But when you put it on, he goes still in a way he does not go still, otherwise. Hector was quiet for a moment. He said, children understand more than we give them credit for. He knows what the helmet means. He knows that when it goes on, you leave. Andromache did not say anything to this. Later that morning, before the day's council, Astyanax found his father in the armor room. The boy stood in the doorway for a moment, calculating in the private way of 3-year-olds who have a plan and are deciding whether to execute it. Then he walked in. Hector was checking the fastenings on a piece of shoulder armor. He looked down at his son. Astyanax looked at the helmet on its stand, the great crested helmet with the horsehair plume. The thing he had decided was something to be afraid of. Hector picked the helmet up and held it out. The boy went very still. Hector said, it is just metal. Here. He held it lower. Astyanax looked at it for a long moment. The way children look at things they have decided are dangerous, with the focused attention of someone taking the threat seriously. Then he reached out and touched the metal with one finger, pulled his hand back, reached out and touched it again, this time with his whole palm. Hector said, see. Astyanax looked up at him. Something in the child's face shifted, some private calculation completing itself. He patted the helmet. Hector set it back on its stand. He picked up his son and held him for a moment, the boy's head against his shoulder. The armor room, quiet around them. There was a conversation with Priam later. The old king was sharp still, sharper than people assumed when they saw the age in his face. And he had been watching the war with the attention of a man who knows the territory because he has been studying it since before most of his advisors were born. Priam said, how long? He did not specify what he meant. He did not need to. Hector said, I do not know. Priam said, guess. Hector said, long enough that we should stop making plans that require us to still be here in 5 years. Neither of them wanted to hear this. Both of them had been thinking it. The shadow had been there for a long time. Hector had not named it out loud to anyone, except Priam. And Priam had not named it to anyone, except Hector. And both of them went out every day and did the work of men who believed they could win, because that was what the situation required. You could know something was likely and still fight it. You could live under the shadow of a thing and still stand in the light, as long as there was light to stand in. He was not a man without flaws. He had a pride in him that could, when the day went badly, tip into something harder, make him hold positions longer than was wise. He was sometimes wrong about tactics and too slow to admit it. He could be hard on the men around him in ways he did not fully see. But he got up every morning before the sun and stood on the terrace and listened to his city, and then he went out and fought for it because it was his city, and the people in it were his people, and there was no version of himself that did anything else. This is the first bill coming. Achilles shows this war. Hector was born into it. The distance between those two sentences is the whole moral weight of what comes next. Agamemnon's tent was the largest in the camp. This was not vanity, or not only vanity. It was function. The man commanding the alliance of every significant Greek kingdom needed a space large enough to hold the kings and generals and advisors who came and went at all hours with their grievances and their requests and their barely concealed calculations about what position would serve them best when this was all over. The tent was a small government. It ran like one, with all the inefficiency and friction that governments run on when the people inside them have competing interests and only nominally share a goal. Agamemnon had been holding this alliance together for 10 years. People who disliked him, which was a substantial number of people, tended to describe him as arrogant and grasping and politically calculating in ways that put expediency above principle. All of this was true. What they left out was that holding this specific collection of men together for this specific length of time was one of the most difficult things any commander had ever done. Agamemnon had done it through authority and threat and bribery, and the particular skill of a man who understood that power was not something you possessed, but a current. You had to keep moving, or it stopped. The problem with that kind of management is that it requires constant fuel. When things went well, the alliance held, because winning was its own argument. When things stalled, when 10 years of siege produced the same walls and the same beach, and the same question of when this would end, the fuel became harder to find. Men who had agreed to follow you toward victory became considerably more complicated when you were leading them toward another season of nothing. Agamemnon was running low on fuel. The incident that started everything began with a priest, Chryse, a priest of Apollo, whose daughter, Chryses, had been taken as a war prize and given to Agamemnon. The priest came with a ransom. He was an old man with the dignity of someone who has spent a lifetime in service to something larger than himself. And he came with proper respect, proper gifts, proper forms of address. He asked for his daughter back. Agamemnon refused. He refused because he could, and because Chryses among the prizes visibly demonstrated his position at the top of the Greek hierarchy, and because at that particular moment giving something back felt like a signal he could not afford to send. What followed was a plague, Apollo's answer to what had been done to his priest. Men died in the camp for days, sick in ways the healers could not address, the deaths carrying the unmistakable quality of punishment, until even the men who did not care about the theology understood that something needed to change. A council was called. A seer named Calchas told them what they already suspected the plague was, Apollo's, and it would end when Chryses was returned to her father. Agamemnon returned her. He was furious about it. Not at Chryse, not at Apollo, not exactly. He was furious the way people are furious when they have been forced to back down from something publicly, and the backing down has cost them something visible that everyone saw them lose. He had given up a prize. He needed a prize back. He looked at the assembled kings and made the calculation that a man makes when he is angry and needs to re-establish something and is not at his most careful. And he said he would take Briseis, who was Achilles' prize. There is a thing that happens in rooms when someone says something that everyone immediately understands is a mistake, and no one says so. A particular quality of silence. Too much stillness. Too many people suddenly very interested in things at a middle distance. The council had this quality for a moment after Agamemnon spoke. Then the positions were stated and the lines were drawn, and what had been a problem became something worse. Briseis was a war captive, in a system where war captives were used as symbols of status and standing. Pieces, in a game played by men with the power to move pieces. She had not been consulted, and would not be. The reality of what she was in this situation was something the kinder accounts of the story tend to soften. This is not a kinder account. What Agamemnon was actually doing was public and calculated. He sent men to Achilles' tent in broad daylight, with the whole camp in a position to see what was happening and why. He was not just taking a prize. He was making a statement, I am above you. This army exists to serve my goals. Your glory is borrowed from my authority. Remember that. Achilles let them take her. Those watching expected an explosion. The fire did not catch. Achilles stood outside his tent and watched the men take Briseis away and did not move. What those close enough to see his face reported afterward was not fury. It was something quieter and in some ways more frightening. A stillness that had calculation behind it. The cold part of a person making a decision in a place where decisions do not get unmade. A soldier named Diomedes was standing near enough to see Achilles' face when the men walked away with Briseis. He said to the man beside him, "Something just changed. I do not know what it is yet." The man beside him said, "He will get over it." Diomedes said, "You have not looked at his face. Agamemnon took Briseis because he could. Achilles refused to fight because he could. Two men. The same logic. Between them. A war that would cost everyone else everything." He did not rage. This is worth staying with because it is the thing people who know the story only partially tend to get wrong. They expect the scene to be large, furniture thrown, voices raised, the full performance of a man whose honor has been stripped from him in front of his peers. That scene would have been, in its way, easier to watch than what actually happened. What actually happened was that Achilles went into his tent and sat down. He sat down and looked at nothing in particular and did not move. Patroclus was there. He had stood beside Achilles while it happened and had felt the air change the way air changes before weather arrives. He had gone into the tent after Achilles and sat across from him and was now doing what he had learned to do in these moments, which was to be present without requiring anything. The afternoon moved. Light changed on the tent walls. Outside, the camp continued its noise. Eventually, Patroclus said, "What do you want to do?" Achilles did not answer right away. When he did, the answer was not about Briseis or Agamemnon. He said, "I want them to understand what they have." Patroclus waited. Achilles said, "They use me the way you use a tool. When the tool is needed, you pick it up. When it is not needed, you put it down. The tool does not have preferences. The tool does not have honor." He paused. "I am going to show them what it looks like when the tool is not there." Patroclus said, "And the men who die while you are showing them that?" Achilles said, "They die because Agamemnon made a choice. The consequences of that choice belong to him." Patroclus did not say anything to this. He had learned the difference between a conversation Achilles was having with him and a conversation Achilles was having with himself, while Patroclus happened to be in the room. This was the second kind. The conclusion had already been reached. The words were the sound of a decision hardening into certainty. What Patroclus was thinking, and did not say, was that the men dying in the gap between two proud men's argument would have a more personal relationship with the consequences than Agamemnon would. He stayed anyway. He always stayed. Thetis came at dusk. She moved through the evening light toward her son's tent and did not need to announce herself. Achilles knew when she was coming, the way people know things about their mothers that cannot be fully explained. She sat beside him, looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." He told her the underneath of it. The thing the argument had opened up, that the argument was not actually about. He said, "I have done everything right. Everything they asked. I have fought their war for 10 years and been excellent at it, and I have never once asked for more than what was agreed. And at the first moment the king needed to demonstrate his authority. He reached for me, because I was the safest option. Because he knew I would not start a civil war over it. Because being the best here means you are the most useful target." He stopped. He said, "What is the point of being what I am if this is what it gets you?" Thetis listened to all of it. She did not say it will be all right. She did not say he will come to regret it. She sat with him in what he was feeling and did not try to move him out of it. Then she said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "Go to Zeus. Ask him to turn the war against the Greeks while I am not fighting. Let them feel what my absence costs. Let Agamemnon explain to his alliance what happens to the results when I am not there." Thetis was quiet for a moment. She said, "If I do this, men will die. Greek men. Men who are not Agamemnon." Achilles said, "Men die here every day. Today they will die for a reason that has a lesson in it." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back with the face he had always had, the one that did not flinch, the one that had been looking at difficult things since he was a child and finding them less difficult than other people found them. She said, "I will go to Zeus." She had said yes to something that would move pieces into place. She could see where the pieces were going. The cost of it, the full cost, was something she would carry from this moment forward. She was going to say yes anyway, because he was her son, and she was running out of ways to protect him, and this was something she could actually do. It was a terrible way to love someone. It was what she had. Outside the tent, the sun went down. The campfires came up one by one along the shore. In the distance, barely visible in the last light, the walls of Troy stood as they had stood for 10 years, patient and solid and unchanged. Inside, Achilles sat with the silence that had been there since the afternoon. The absence was already present even before it officially began. The thing he was about to withhold from a war that did not know yet what it was about to lose. This was the first bill, and it was only the beginning. He asked his mother to make the world hurt the way he was hurting. She said yes. The question is not whether she was wrong to say yes. The question is, what kind of pain asks that of someone who loves you? The first week was almost imperceptible. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, when the losses had accumulated enough to be undeniable. In the first week, the absence of Achilles was something you could almost argue yourself out of. The line held. The daily skirmishes went roughly as they had gone. Men died at roughly the rate men had been dying, a rate everyone had made their private peace with years ago. You could look at the first week and tell yourself it was fine. The second week was different. It started at the eastern edge of the Greek line, where a Trojan push that would normally have been repelled in an hour took most of the morning and cost 3 times the usual casualties. The men who held that section were good soldiers, experienced, the kind of unit that had learned to function well under pressure. They held, but the holding was harder than it should have been, and everyone on that section knew it, even if they did not say it out loud. The reason was not complicated. When Achilles was fighting, the Trojan command had to account for him in every decision. Where was he on the field? What was his current position? If we push here, can he reach this point before we consolidate? That calculation ran underneath every Trojan tactical choice like a river under ice, invisible but shaping everything above it. Remove Achilles from the field, and the calculation changed. The Trojans could commit more fully to each push. They could accept risks they would not otherwise accept. Hector understood this before anyone in the Greek camp was willing to admit it. He had spent 10 years reading this war the way a navigator reads water, looking at the surface for what it told him about what was underneath. He had watched Achilles fight enough times to understand not just what he was capable of individually, but what his presence did to the architecture of every engagement. Achilles was not just a powerful fighter. He was a gravitational force. Everything arranged itself around him. Greek and Trojan both. Now that force was gone. Hector did not celebrate this. He was not a man who celebrated things that might be temporary. He had seen Achilles arrive late to an engagement, seen what happened when he showed up after the fighting had been going badly. He knew how quickly the situation could reverse, but he also knew that the space that had opened was real, and that not using it would be the kind of failure you could not explain to the men who had died waiting for an opportunity. He pushed, carefully, in the way Hector did everything, testing each step before committing to it, pulling back where Greek resistance was stronger than expected, pressing where it was. It looked from a distance like the same war it had always been. From inside, in the specific engagements, in the small decisions made by commanders on both sides, in the space of a breath, it was different. The Greeks were fighting without the knowledge that Achilles was coming. They had always had that knowledge before, even when he was not immediately present. He was in the camp. He could be called. He could arrive. The knowledge of that possibility had a weight to it that changed how you fought, what risks you accepted, where you placed your courage. Take the possibility away, and the courage had to carry more of its own weight. a soldier named Thetis, who had been at Troy since the first year. He was sitting with two younger men one evening after a day that had gone badly. Not catastrophically, just badly. The kind of day where nothing worked quite right and you got back to camp feeling like the ground had shifted slightly under everything. One of the younger men said, "Is it always like this?" Thetis took a moment before answering. He said, "No." The younger man said, "Is it Achilles being gone? Is that what this is?" Thetis said, "The Trojans know something we know. They know what this army looks like without him in it. They have had 10 years to wonder. Now they are finding out." The younger man said, "When does he come back?" Thetis looked at the fire for a while. He said, "When something happens that he cannot stay out of." He did not say what he thought that something might be. He had been at war long enough to know that the events which pulled proud men back into fights they had declared themselves done with were rarely the events anyone would have chosen. They were usually the events that cost the most. Inside the tent that had become a kind of island, Achilles was playing the lyre. This detail was reported with varying degrees of disbelief by men who heard it second-hand. The men close enough to hear it directly did not find it as strange as it might seem. They understood that the lyre was not indifference. It was what a man did with his hands when he could not do the thing his hands were made for, and could not sleep, and could not think about anything except the thing he was not doing. Patroclus listened to the playing from outside. He was doing what he had been doing for weeks, sitting close enough to be present without being inside the argument happening in Achilles' head. He was also watching the camp, watching the men come back from the days that went badly, the way units bunched tighter after hard days, the way conversations stopped when officers passed, the quality of the silences between men who had made it back and were doing the accounting of who had not. 3 scenes from those weeks stayed with him longer than the others. A unit returning from the eastern line at midday, when they should have been there until evening. Too few of them, moving too quietly for men who had just been in a fight. Patroclus counted them as they passed and did not let his face show what the counting told him. A young soldier sitting outside the medical tent at dusk. Not injured, just sitting, with the particular emptiness of someone who has processed what he saw today and has not yet decided what to do with it. He sat there for a long time. Nobody talked to him. Nobody knew what to say. An officer named Meriones, standing outside Agamemnon's tent at dawn, clearly having been there all night, delivering a report in the flat voice of a man who has moved past the point where the news surprises him and has arrived at the place where he is simply required to keep delivering it. Patroclus watched all of this and said nothing to Achilles. There was nothing to say that would land right. Achilles knew what was happening. He was not unaware. He was choosing every day to remain where he was. And every day the choice was harder to maintain, because the evidence of its cost was accumulating in the faces of the men who walked past the tent. Pointing this out would not change the choice. It would only make the space between them smaller and less useful. What Patroclus was doing in those weeks was something quieter and more difficult than argument. He was staying, being the thing he had always been in Achilles' life. The person who did not leave when leaving would have been easier, who was simply there in the way that very few people managed to be there without needing something back from it. Achilles was not absent from the war. His absence had become the war. The war didn't care about his honor. The war just kept going, and the people dying in it were not the ones who had insulted him. He had killed someone when he was 11 years old. This is the fact that shaped everything after it. The fact that explained how he ended up in Phthia, how he ended up at Troy. It was not the whole of who he was, but it was the event that the rest of his life organized itself around. The way a river organizes itself around a rock that fell into it long ago. His name was Cleisonimus, another boy. Patroclus Age, from a family in Opus. They were playing a game that involved dice, and the game went wrong the way games between boys go wrong. An accusation of cheating. A shove. And then something in Patroclus that he had not known was there came up very fast, and he hit Cleisonimus once, and Cleisonimus fell and did not get up. He had not meant to kill him. This was true. It was also the kind of thing that is true and does not help. His father sent him away, not in anger, but in the way the world worked. A boy who had killed another boy could not stay in the place where it had happened. His father sent him to Thea, to the household of Peleus, with a request that the boy be taken in and given the kind of structure that his father, with his own grief, could not now provide. Peleus took him in. Achilles was already gone to Chiron. So for the first years Patroclus was in Phthia without him. He was quiet in that household, careful in the specific way of someone who has learned suddenly and completely that actions have permanent consequences and is recalibrating every movement in light of that knowledge. He did the work that was asked. He paid attention. He did not cause problems. When Achilles came back from Pelion, he was 10, almost 11, and Patroclus was 13. They met the way children who live in the same place meet, gradually and without ceremony, the relationship forming through proximity before either of them had decided anything about it. What Patroclus noticed about Achilles first was the confidence, not arrogance, or not only arrogance, but something deeper and more structural, an orientation toward the world that simply did not include the possibility of certain kinds of failure. Achilles moved through rooms, the way water moves through open space, into wherever there was room, without checking first whether it was his to move into. What Achilles noticed about Patroclus first was that he was the only person in the household who did not look at him with either envy or deference. Patroclus looked at him the way you look at something that interests you, but that you have not yet decided what to make of. This made Achilles curious, which made him pay attention, which is how things usually started with him. The friendship, if that word captures it, and it captures part of it, formed over years and through everything that years contain, training together, eating together, the thousand small arguments and reconciliations of young men who spend too much time in close proximity. Achilles was faster and more gifted physically. Patroclus was older and in certain ways steadier, less prone to the swings that came with Achilles' intensity. They were opposite enough to create friction and similar enough to make the friction interesting rather than destructive. The ancient world remembered their bond in more than one way, as friendship, as devotion, as something that went deeper than the usual categories could hold. The Iliad gives us a grief so total, it reshaped a war, what that grief was made of, what the bond was made of at its center. Readers have been arguing about for 3,000 years. This story will not settle that argument. It will only show what was there. What was there was this. Patroclus was the only person in Achilles' life who made the full version of Achilles possible. Not the warrior, not the greatest fighter in the world. The person underneath those things, the one who played the lyre in the evenings and argued about small things, and sometimes went quiet in a way that no one else was patient enough to sit with until it passed. Patroclus sat with it. There was a night on Pelion, years before Troy, when they had stayed up past the point where they should have slept. Summer on the mountain, warm enough to lie on their backs, looking at the sky. Neither of them performing anything for anyone. No camp to maintain. No reputation to project. Achilles said, "Do you ever think about going home? Not to the camp. Home." Patroclus thought about Opus for a moment. The house where he grew up. The family that had sent him away kindly and permanently. He said, "I think about it sometimes. But Phthia is more home now." Achilles said, "It is for me too, more than Troy." Patroclus said, "Then why are we at Troy?" Achilles was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You know why?" Patroclus said, "I know what you said on the beach when you were 9. I want to know what you think now." Achilles looked at the stars for a while. He said, "I think I am the same person I was on that beach. I think I want the same thing, and I think it is possible that what I want is going to cost more than I knew when I was 9, and I am not sure what to do with that." Patroclus said, "What do you mean by cost?" Achilles said, "I do not know exactly. That is the part I cannot see yet." They lay there without talking. The mountain was quiet. The fire was low. Patroclus said, "You know, I am going to be there regardless. Whatever it costs. I want you to know I am not there because I have to be." Achilles turned his head and looked at him. Patroclus said, "I am there because it is you. That is the whole reason." This was the conversation Achilles carried with him into the years at Troy, and the months in the tent, and the slow, terrible weeks of the war going wrong without him. He carried it the way you carry the things that told you who you were, before the world started telling you who you were supposed to be. The thing Patroclus understood, that he had understood for a long time, was that Achilles at his best and Achilles at his worst were the same person, the same intensity, the same absoluteness, just pointed in different directions. When it pointed outward, toward the field, it was magnificent and terrifying. When it turned inward, or went still, the way it had been still since Agamemnon and Briseis, it became a different kind of terrifying. He had watched the weeks accumulate, the men coming back from bad days, the slow turning of the war in a direction he did not like, the faces of soldiers who walked past their tent and sometimes looked at it in a way that did not quite hide what they wanted to say. He had said nothing, because there was nothing to say that Achilles did not already know. But he was running out of the thing that had kept him beside that choice. The second bill was coming. He could feel it, the way he had felt things his whole life. The pressure of something building behind the ordinary surface of days. The river, finding the crack in the rock, slow and then all at once. Patroclus was the only person in the world who knew Achilles well enough to be afraid for him. Not of him, for him, and he was running out of time to do anything about it. The smell reached the camp before the sight did. Smoke, but not cook fire smoke, heavier, with something underneath it that took a moment to identify, and then, once identified, could not be unfamiliar again. It was the smell of pitch and rope and treated wood, the specific combination that men who had worked around vessels their whole lives knew immediately, and men who had not learned at Troy. Patroclus was outside the tent when it started. He heard the change in the camp before he saw it, a shift in the quality of noise, voices rising in a direction that was not the usual direction, feet moving faster than they moved on ordinary mornings. He stood up. To the south, past the edge of the camp's main body, a column of smoke was rising, dark and thick. The kind that meant something substantial was burning and had been burning long enough to establish itself. As he watched, a second column appeared to the left of the first. The ships. Hector had done what Achilles' absence had made possible. He had pushed the Trojan line all the way to the Greek ships. This had not happened before. In 10 years of siege and skirmish, the Trojans had never reached the ships. The ships were the psychological limit of the Greek position, the thing that could not be touched without changing the fundamental nature of what was happening here. They were the way home. They were proof that home existed, that there was somewhere beyond this beach, that the war had edges. While they stood, unburned and intact, the Greek position had a floor under it. Now the floor was on fire. Inside the tent, Achilles had stopped playing. Patroclus went in. Achilles was standing in the center of the tent, not moving. The lyre set aside. He was looking at the tent wall as if he could see through it, which, in a way, he could. The sounds from outside were enough to construct the picture without needing to see it directly. Patroclus said, "The ships." Achilles said, "I know." Patroclus waited for what would come after that. He waited for the movement toward the armor, for the thing that had been approaching for weeks and had now arrived in the form of smoke columns and the sound of men dying at the edge of the camp. Achilles did not move. Patroclus understood then that the decision was not as simple as he had thought. He had assumed, without fully examining the assumption, that the ships would be the line, that when the cost became impossible to look away from, Achilles would cross back over the position he had taken. He had been wrong. The position was not about tactics. It was about something that tactics could not resolve, something in Achilles that had decided a thing and could not undecide it without losing what the deciding had cost him. Patroclus looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Let me go." Achilles turned. Patroclus said, "Give me your armor. Let me take your men out. The Trojans will see the armor and pull back. They do not know. They will think it is you. It will be enough to push them off the ships and buy the Greeks time to regroup." The air in the tent changed. Achilles looked at him with an expression that Patroclus could not fully read, which was unusual because he could usually read Achilles. There were several things in it at the same time. Something that was the beginning of agreement. Something that was very far from comfortable with what it was beginning to agree to. And something underneath both of those that was harder to name. A resistance that was not about tactics. That was about the specific person standing in front of him and what it meant to put that specific person in that specific position. He said, "You go to the ships. You push them back from the ships. You do not follow them toward Troy. You pull back when they pull back. You do not chase them." Patroclus said, "I understand." Achilles said, "I need you to hear what I am saying. Not the ships. Not Troy. You push them off and you stop." Patroclus said, "I hear you." There was a moment between them that contained more than either of them said. Achilles put his hand on Patroclus's shoulder. The way you touch something you are not ready to let go of, but are letting go of anyway. Then he went to the armor. He helped him put it on. This was not a small thing. The armor of Achilles was not ordinary equipment. It had been made for him, fitted to him, carrying in its surfaces 10 years of war. Watching someone else put it on was watching something that had been, for a long time, an extension of himself become separate. He checked the fastenings with the attention of a man who is doing a practical task and refusing to think about what the practical task means. Patroclus was quiet while this happened. He understood the weight of it. When it was done, Achilles stepped back and looked at him. Patroclus in his armor, the most recognizable figure on the Greek side of this war. And it was not Achilles wearing it. He said, "Come back." 2 words, not nothing. Achilles put his armor on someone else's body and told himself it was strategy. Patroclus put it on and did not tell himself anything. He just walked out. When the Trojans saw the armor, they stopped. Not all of them. Not immediately. But enough. A ripple of hesitation that moved through the Trojan line from the point where Patroclus first came into sight, spreading outward the way disturbance spreads through water when something large breaks the surface. Men who had been pressing forward with the momentum of an advance that had been going better than any advance in 10 years suddenly found reasons to reassess their position. The armor was that specific, that recognizable, not just to the Greeks, who knew it from years of fighting beside it, but to the Trojans, who knew it from years of fighting against it. Everyone on this field had learned to read that armor at a distance as a signal requiring immediate attention. What they were seeing now was the armor. The motion was slightly different. The way the weight was carried across the shoulders, the angle at which the helmet sat, the particular rhythm of the walk, these were not the same. But in the smoke and noise and confusion of a line that had overextended itself, the differences were not immediately obvious. Patroclus moved into the gap that the hesitation created. He fought well. This needs to be said plainly, because it matters. He was not a poor imitation. He was a very good soldier who had spent 10 years alongside the best soldier in the world and had absorbed things from that proximity that could not be fully accounted for by any formal training. He was fast. His decisions were good. He read the field in a way that spoke to everything 10 years beside Achilles had taught him. He pushed the Trojans off the ships. This took the better part of the afternoon, and it was hard fighting. The kind that left men exhausted in the bones, rather than just in the muscles. But it worked. The fires that had been started were brought under control. The ships that had been reached were defended and held. The Trojan advance, which had felt inevitable an hour before, was reversed. The Greek camp began to breathe again. And then Patroclus went further. He did not decide to do it in a single moment. It was a series of small decisions, each one reasonable in the context of the previous one. The Trojans were pulling back. Pulling back meant retreating. Retreating Trojans, if you pressed the advantage, became routed Trojans. And routed Trojans were an opportunity that good commanders did not leave on the field. He pressed. The Trojan line moved. He moved with it. The distance between him and the ships increased. The distance between him and the walls of Troy decreased. Achilles had said, not the ships. He had said that. Patroclus had heard him. What Achilles had also said. Implicitly, in every choice he had made for the past weeks, was that the cost of his absence was acceptable, that the deaths happening while he sat in his tent were the price of a principle he was not willing to give up. Patroclus had watched those costs accumulate day after day, and found no way to name them to Achilles that would land right. Now he was on a field where the momentum was with him, and the Trojans were moving, and the thing that had been wrong for weeks was, in this specific moment, going the other way. He kept moving. In Homer's world, this was not only about tactics. The gods were part of the machinery of events. Moving inside, the choices men made, present in the moments where the ground shifted beneath a person's feet. Apollo was watching Patroclus advance toward walls that were not meant to fall today. Homer lets the god move inside that moment, the way gods move in his poem. Not as spectacle, but as the sudden wrongness that comes just before everything changes. Patroclus lost the rhythm. It happened between one moment and the next. He was fighting well, and then he was not. A half step off. A decision made a beat too late. Euphorbus hit him from the side with the precision of a man who has seen an opening and taken it cleanly. The blow was not fatal, but it broke his concentration, broke his forward movement, left him exposed in a way he had not been a moment before. Hector was there. Hector had been watching the advance of the armor, reading it the way he read everything on this field, carefully and without the emotional weight that other men brought to the sight of those particular colors. He had felt, early, that something was different. The movement was not quite right. The choices were not quite the choices that armor usually made. He had not been certain enough to act on it before the momentum was too great. But he had been watching. Now the momentum was gone, and the man inside the armor was exposed, and Hector made the decision that the situation offered him. He killed Patroclus outside the walls of Troy, on a day that had started as a rescue operation and had become, through a series of decisions that each made sense in the moment they were made, something else entirely. The armor came off. Hector took it. This was what happened after battles in the world they were fighting in. The armor of the defeated belonged to the man who defeated him. Hector took it without ceremony, the way a man takes what a fair fight has given him. He did not know, in that moment, what he had actually taken. He did not know that what he was holding was not just equipment, that it was the piece of the world that held a specific person together, that somewhere back at the Greek camp, the man it had been built for was about to find out what it cost to send the most important person in your life into a situation you told yourself was controlled. He died doing the right thing for the right reasons, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The war did not distinguish between those categories. The field was quieter now, the particular quiet that comes after fighting. Not peaceful, nothing like peaceful, but emptied. the way a room feels after something loud has happened in it. Men move through the aftermath with the efficiency of soldiers who have learned not to linger near what they cannot change. The Trojan line had pulled back toward the city, not in rout, but in the orderly withdrawal of men who had accomplished what they came to do and knew when to stop. Hector stood where Patroclus had fallen. He looked at the armor for a moment before touching it. This was not reverence exactly. It was the pause of a man who understands that what he is about to do has a weight to it, and is giving himself a breath to acknowledge that weight before the practical requirements of the situation take over. The armor of Achilles was extraordinary in the way that things made for a specific purpose by someone who understood that purpose completely are extraordinary. Every piece had been fitted to him, adjusted over years, carrying in its surfaces the specific evidence of 10 years of war. There were marks on the shield that had accumulated, meaning the way marks accumulate on things that have been in the middle of important events for a long time. Hector had fought against this armor more times than he could count. He lifted the breastplate first. It was heavier than he expected, which surprised him because he had expected it to be heavy. The weight was not just metal. He understood this as a thought that was not quite rational and was true anyway. He put it on. The fit was imperfect in the small ways that things fit when made for someone else. Achilles was built differently than Hector. The proportions subtly wrong in ways that a man who wore armor for a living felt immediately. The breastplate sat a half-inch too low across the shoulders. The greaves were slightly too long in the shin. Nothing that would impair movement significantly. Enough to feel like wearing something that knew it was not home. In Homer's poem, Zeus looked at Hector in that moment with something the tradition describes as pity. Not because Hector had done something wrong, because by pulling that armor toward himself, he had pulled something else toward himself that he could not yet see. Homer lets the gods know the ends of things while men are still living the middles. Zeus knew what the armor meant now that Hector was wearing it. Hector did not. He finished dressing in the armor. The men around him saw him, and a sound came from them. A collective response that was part recognition and part something harder to name. He was their commander, their best soldier, the man they trusted above all others on this field. Seeing him in Achilles' armor was not simply seeing him in captured equipment. It was seeing the armor that had been the most feared thing on the other side of this war now on the body of the man they already believed in most. They cheered. Hector accepted this with the composure he brought to everything, acknowledging it without performing in response to it. He was already thinking about what came next. The advance had been successful beyond what he had projected. The ships had been reached, even with the reversal at the end. The day had shifted. Something fundamental about the shape of this war. He needed to think about how to use that shift before the Greeks recovered from it. He did not think about what the armor felt like. He was too good a commander to spend attention on things he could not change. On the wall of Troy, Andromache was watching. She had been watching most of the afternoon. From the section of wall that gave the best view of the field below, she had watched the advance, had watched the ships beginning to burn, had watched the change when the new figure appeared in the armor that everyone on the wall knew. She had not been certain, watching from that distance, but she had felt something, an instinct about the movement that she could not fully articulate. The way he moved was familiar but wrong in the small ways you only notice if you have spent years watching someone move. She had spent years watching Hector move. She did not say anything. She was not certain enough, and the cost of being wrong felt high in a way she could not explain. Then the end of the afternoon happened and she saw Hector clearly, at a distance that allowed no uncertainty. Her husband, in the armor of Achilles. She looked at this for a long moment. She understood it the way she understood most things about this war, through its meaning for specific people rather than its meaning in the abstract. Her husband was wearing the armor of the man who had been the single greatest threat to everyone inside these walls for 10 years. Her husband had, in some sense, taken that threat and made it his. She also knew in the way that she knew, things she had not been told and could not have explained the source of, that the armor on his body was going to matter in ways that were not finished yet, that taking it had pulled something toward him that had not previously been aimed at him with this specific quality of focus. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The evening was coming in off the water, and the field below was going quiet, in the way it went quiet after hard days. Behind her, from somewhere in the rooms of the palace, she heard Astyanax. He had been kept inside today. He did not know what had happened on the field. He was 3 years old, and he was somewhere in the palace making the sounds of a child who has found something interesting and is doing it with full commitment. She listened to him for a moment. Then she turned away from the field and went inside. Hector put on the armor of the man who would kill him. Every soldier below cheered. No one in Troy told him to take it off. Antilochus ran. He had been given the task that no one wanted, chosen because he was young enough to be fast and trusted enough that the news would not be distorted on the way and close enough to Achilles, in the way of men who have fought beside each other for years, that his presence might soften something that could not be softened. He ran through the camp with the news inside him like something he was trying not to spill. He reached the tent. He stopped outside it for a moment. His body stopped on its own, the way bodies sometimes make decisions before the mind catches up with what is actually being asked of them. He went in. Achilles was standing in the center of the tent. He had heard the running. He had heard the change in the camp outside. The particular quality of noise that a large piece of bad news makes as it moves through a population of people attuned to bad news and who recognize its shape. He was standing and looking at the entrance of the tent when Antilochus came through it. He looked at Antilochus's face. He knew. Before Antilochus opened his mouth, before the words had been arranged into their order, in the space between one breath and the next, looking at the face of a young man who had run across a camp with something terrible inside him and could not figure out how to begin. Achilles knew. Antilochus, said Patroclus. He could not say the rest of it. He had thought he could. He had rehearsed it running. The words in order. He could not say it. He did not need to. Achilles sat down. He sat in the specific way of someone whose body has made a decision about what position is possible right now and has communicated that decision to the legs without consulting anyone else. He sat down on the ground of the tent, and he looked at the space in front of him, and he did not say anything. Antilochus stood there. The camp outside continued its noise. Somewhere, a long way off, someone was giving orders. Closer. The sound of men moving equipment. The particular percussion of an army settling in after a day of fighting. Normal sounds. The same sounds as every other evening. Achilles put his hands on the ground beside him. Then he reached for the earth in front of him and lifted a handful of it and poured it over his head. He did this slowly. The sound he made was not a sound Antilochus had words for afterward. He said to people who asked him about it later, it was not like a person crying. It was not like a person screaming. It was something underneath both of those. Something that a human body produces when it is doing its best to process something too large for it. He said the sound carried. Outside the tent, men who had been going about the ordinary business of the evening stopped. Not because they understood immediately what they were hearing, but because the sound had a quality that required stopping. You did not walk past it. You did not continue what you were doing. You stopped, and you listened, and you understood. Somewhere, before the mind put it into words, that something had changed. The sound reached the ships. There were men who said afterward they heard it from the walls of Troy. Thetis heard it at the bottom of the sea. She came up out of the water and moved through the camp and reached the tent and went in. Achilles was on the ground. The dirt on his head and face had mixed with grief into something that looked like the earth itself was trying to absorb him. Antilochus was still there, standing to one side, not knowing whether to stay or go, and choosing stay because leaving felt wrong. Thetis sat down beside her son on the ground of the tent. She did not say, "I know." She did not say, "I am here." She sat down and put her hand on the back of his head and stayed there. After a long time he said, "I want to die." She did not say, "Do not say that." She did not say, "You have so much ahead of you." She had never spoken to him in those kinds of sentences, and she did not start now. She said, "You will die. That has always been true. You chose it a long time ago. But not today." He said, "Why not today?" She said, "Because today there is something you have to do first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hector." She said, "Yes." He said, "And after?" She said, "After? You will have what you always wanted. Everyone who ever lives will know your name." She paused. She said, "I want you to know that I would trade every one of those people for one more year of you in Thea growing old." He did not say anything to this. She held him there on the ground of the tent for a long time. Outside, the war continued the way it always continued, without particular concern for what was happening inside one tent on a beach in the 9th year of a siege. No, the 10th year. It was the 10th year. She had to keep reminding herself, because the years had blurred into each other, the way years blur when you are dreading their end. At some point Antilochus left. Neither of them marked when. The fire in the tent burned low and was not fed, and went lower. Thetis sat with her son in the dark and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would help. She had decided a long time ago that she would not spend the time she had with him on words that did not help. She had known this was coming. She had known since the beach in Thessaly, when he looked at the water and she saw the answer in his face before he said anything. She had known, and she had tried anyway. Skyros and the warnings and the years of watching from the sea. And none of it had changed anything. Her son was on the ground in front of her, with the dirt of a foreign country on his face, and Patroclus was dead. She stayed. For 10 years Achilles had chosen glory, lying on the ground of a foreign shore covered in dust. He was not thinking about glory. He was thinking about Patroclus. The distance between those two things was the whole story, and he was only now beginning to understand it. This was the second bill, and unlike the first one, it could not be undone. Hephaestus worked through the night. This is how the tradition remembers it. Thetis went to the forge on Olympus and asked for what her son needed. And Hephaestus, who owed her a debt from a long time ago, worked through the night to make it. Whether the forge was on a mountain or in the fire of the earth itself, the tradition is consistent about one thing. He worked without stopping. When Thetis arrived in the morning, the armor was done. Hephaestus was the god of the forge, which meant he was the god of things made by hand, of the knowledge that lived in the body rather than in the mind, of the specific intelligence that exists in the relationship between a craftsman and his material. He was also, the tradition notes without much emphasis, Lame. He moved through his forge with the accommodation of someone who has made permanent peace with a limitation and built his entire life around the parts of himself that worked. The most perfect equipment ever made for the most physically perfect warrior was made by the god who could not walk without difficulty. The tradition holds this detail without explaining it. It is there for whoever wants to find it. The shield was made first. What Hephaestus put on the shield was not decoration in the way decoration is usually meant. He built the world into it. A sky with a sun and a moon, and the stars that sailors used to navigate. 2 cities, one at peace and one at war. In the city at peace there were weddings, people dancing in the streets, the specific human activity of celebration. There were also judges and disputes, and the ordinary machinery of people trying to live together and work out what was fair. In the city at war, there were armies outside the walls, and men fighting, and the dead. Around the edges of the shield he put the ocean, surrounding everything. Then the breastplate, the helmet, the greaves. Each piece made with the same attention, the same completeness. The same quality of being made for exactly this person, for exactly this purpose. When Thetis carried the armor to the tent, it was morning, and Achilles had been awake all night. Not planning, not preparing, just awake. In the way that grief keeps you awake, when the thing it is processing is too large for sleep. He looked at the armor when she set it down. The other men in the tent looked at it too. There was a quality to it that was not quite like looking at other armor. Other armor was equipment. This was something that had been made with the specific intention of being the best thing of its kind that could exist. And that intention was visible in it, the way intention is sometimes visible in things made by people who understood completely what they were doing and cared completely about doing it right. Achilles picked up the shield. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the cities on it, the one at peace and the one at war, the weddings and the battles, the judges and the dead. He looked at the ocean around the edges of everything. He set it back down. He began to put the armor on. The myrmidons helped with the pieces that required a second pair of hands. This was done in silence, the focused silence of men performing a task that all of them understand the weight of: the breastplate, the greaves, the helmet, its crest catching the morning light from the tent entrance. When it was done, he stood in it, and it fit the way things fit when made specifically for you, not just to your measurements but to your nature. The way things fit that were made by someone who understood exactly what they were for. Thetis watched him. She had made this trip to the forge and back with the speed the urgency required. She had asked for what her son needed, and she had received it, and she had brought it to him. This was the last practical thing she could do for him. She understood that with complete clarity. She had dressed him for war before, when he was young and the armor was smaller and the war was hypothetical. She had done it with the same hands she was using now, making sure what covered him was secure. She had known then that there was a limit to what any covering could do. She knew it more completely now. Achilles looked at her when the armor was on. She looked at him, a conversation with no words in it, between a mother who had tried everything available to her and a son who had always known what he was going to do and had done it anyway and was now standing on the far side of the cost of that, in new armor, on a morning where everything was different than it had been a week ago. She did not say, "Be careful." He was not capable of careful in the way she meant it, and they both knew this. She said, "I love you." He said, "I know." She left before he did. She could not watch him walk out of the tent in that armor toward what she knew was coming. She went back to the water because the water was where she lived and because there was nothing left for her to do on land. The business with Agamemnon happened that morning, brief and cold and functional. Agamemnon returned Briseis. He offered gifts, the formal acknowledgement that he had been wrong, structured in the way these acknowledgements were structured to allow both parties to move forward without either of them having to fully inhabit the word sorry. Achilles accepted the gifts the way you accept the administrative requirements of a situation that is happening alongside the real situation, dealing with the paperwork, because the paperwork is there and not because it matters. Agamemnon watched him during this exchange. He had seen Achilles in many states over 10 years. He had seen him triumphant, angry, bored, impatient. He had not seen him like this. The quality of his attention was different. Usually, Achilles was paying attention to everything around him with a kind of distributed alertness that was one of the things that made him what he was on the field. Today he was paying attention to one thing, only one thing, and it was not in the tent. The hug Agamemnon offered at the end of the exchange was not accepted. Achilles turned away before it could be completed. This was noted and not commented on. The situation did not call for comment. The men watched him walk out. The myrmidons, who had been waiting outside, formed up without being told. They knew what was happening. They had known since the night before. They were ready in the way that men are ready when they have been waiting a long time for something and it has finally arrived. Achilles looked at them. He said, We go for Hector. He put on the new armor and it fit perfectly. It always does, when you have nothing left to lose. There is a word the Greeks used that gets translated as rampage, but does not quite mean rampage. The word is aristeia. It described the moment in a battle when a particular fighter moved beyond the ordinary registers of fighting into something else. Something that people watching from both sides understood as different in kind from what they had been watching before. Every great warrior had an aristeia. The poems recorded them because they were the moments when what a man was built for became fully visible. When the gap between him and ordinary men was not a matter of degree but of category. What happened when Achilles returned to the field was an aristeia with something different inside it. The form was there, a warrior moving through a battlefield in a way that other men could not match, making decisions faster than his opponents could respond to them, occupying space on the field in a way that changed the shape of everything around him. The physical facts were the same. The cause was not. He was not fighting for glory, for the Greeks, for the resolution of the war, for any of the reasons that might later be arranged around his return, because those reasons made better poetry. He was fighting because Patroclus was dead, and the only thing his body knew how to do with that was this. The Trojans who had fought against Achilles before said afterward, the ones who survived to say anything, that it was not the same, that there was a quality to what they were facing that was different from before. The previous version of him was already beyond what most men could handle. This version was not trying to win. It was trying to empty itself of something and using the field to do it. You cannot fight that. You can only get out of its way or not get out of its way in time. The Myrmidons moved with him in the disciplined formation of men who had fought together for 10 years. But even within the formation there was a distinction between Achilles and everyone else. He was the point of something, and the something was not a spear. Hector was not on the field when Achilles first returned. The Trojan command had seen what was coming from the walls and had made decisions accordingly. The line pulled back. Positions were conceded that would normally have been held. This was not cowardice. It was the tactical intelligence that recognizes when the situation has changed and adjusts, rather than insisting on a plan made for different conditions. Hector was told Achilles is back. He was told this by 3 separate people in the space of a few minutes, each with the urgency of someone delivering information they believe has not yet been received. He received it with the composure of someone who had been waiting for it and found the arrival less surprising than the waiting had been. He said, I know. He went to the wall and looked at the field. He watched for a while, the way a man watches something he is going to have to make a decision about and is giving himself the time to see it clearly before he decides. He watched the movement of it, the shape of it, the specific quality of what was happening down there on the field. He said, to no one, in particular, this is different. The man beside him said he fights the same way. Hector said he is not fighting the same way. He kept watching. There is a detail from the Iliad that later accounts tend to pass over quickly because it does not fit easily into the story of Achilles as unstoppable force. The river, Scamander, which ran along the edge of the battlefield and which the armies had been fighting near for 10 years, rose against him. The river, in the poem's account, spoke. It was full of bodies. Men Achilles had killed had fallen into it in such numbers that the water could not move properly, and the river god was angry about it. This is the image Homer chooses for the height of Achilles' return to battle. Not a triumphant charge, not an overwhelming victory, a river too full of the dead to flow. Achilles fought the river. This is in the poem. Literally, he stood in the water and fought the current and the weight of what it was carrying. He refused to stop. He refused to be stopped by anything, including the physical world's objection to what he was doing. He eventually moved past it. The dead were still in the river. On the wall, Hector had stopped watching and had come down from the wall and was walking toward the gate. The men around him knew what this meant. Some of them tried to say something. He kept walking. He was going outside. He had made the decision the way he made all decisions on this field. By reading the situation until it told him what it required, and then doing that thing without further argument. The situation required him to be outside the gate. He was going to be outside the gate. The city was behind him. His family was behind him. The whole of what he had been fighting for 10 years was behind him. And something was coming toward him across the field that had stopped being a man in any conventional sense and had become, at least for these days, something that grief had assembled from the parts of a man and sent out into the world to do what grief does when it has no other way to move. He walked through the gate. He killed everything he could reach. Patroclus was still dead. The walls of Troy had been standing for a long time before this war. They had been built by people who understood that a wall was not just stone. It was an argument. A wall of that height and thickness said something to everyone who looked at it from outside and from inside both. And what it said was, the people who built this intended to stay. They planned their permanence into the stone. They were not a people who expected to leave. Hector had grown up inside those walls. He knew them the way you know the geography of childhood, not as information, but as the shape of the world itself, the thing against which you measured everything else. He knew which sections caught the afternoon light and which stayed in shadow. He knew the sound the main gates made, the particular groan of the mechanism that had been slightly misaligned for as long as he could remember, and that no one had ever quite fixed. He knew the view from every section of the rampart. He was standing outside all of it now. The gates were behind him. His father was on the wall above him. His mother was on the wall above him. He had heard them both. Their voices carrying down in the way voices carry down from height, asking him to come in. Priam, with the dignity of an old man who has outlived most of what he hoped for and is down to the essential ones. Hecuba, with the rawness of a mother, watching her son stand somewhere she does not want him to stand. He had heard them, and he had not come in. The decision was not simple, and it was not made once. He had made it in pieces. Over the weeks of Achilles being absent, and over the hours of Achilles returning, and over the specific minutes of watching the field today, as the shape of what was coming became impossible to misread. He had stood on the wall and watched, and at some point in that watching he had come down and walked to the gate and gone through it. There is a kind of reckoning that people in certain positions arrive at, usually after a long time. That is not about winning or losing in the immediate sense. It is about something harder to name, about whether the life you have been living has been the life you were supposed to live, about whether the choices you made were the choices the best version of yourself would have made. Hector had been fighting this war for 10 years with the understanding that Troy might not survive it. He had not pretended otherwise to himself. Not in the private hours when pretense falls away and you are left with what you actually believe. He had fought anyway. He had woken up every morning and put the armor on and gone out because the city needed him to go out, and the people in it were his people, and there was no version of himself that did anything else. That was not nothing. Whatever happened today, that was not nothing. He heard Achilles before he saw him. The noise of the approach. The combination of sounds, a man in full armor moving at speed, makes, and underneath it, something else. Harder to categorize. The quality of intention that very focused things emit when they are moving toward a specific destination. Hector had fought enough battles to have learned to read these things. He read this one. Then he saw him. Homer does not remove Hector's fear. He makes it part of the tragedy. A man who had stood his ground in every engagement for 10 years. A man whose courage was not in question by anyone who had ever watched him fight. Saw Achilles coming across that field and felt what he felt. The poem is honest about this. The gods moved inside that fear, the way Homer's gods move inside everything. Not as external force, but as the weight of what the moment actually contained, pressing down on a man who was trying to stand up under it. Hector ran. Later, accounts would struggle with this moment. The tradition needed Hector to be brave, and Hector was brave. That was established across 10 years of evidence, and the image of him running sat uncomfortably alongside everything else the tradition had to say about him. The honest version is simpler. To Hector, the figure moving toward him no longer looked like a man seeking honor. It looked like grief wearing armor, and you cannot fight grief. You can only stand in front of it. He ran because his body understood before his mind could argue with it that what was coming had stopped operating in the register, that his training and experience and courage had been built to address. He ran 3 times around the walls of Troy, and his father watched from above, and his mother watched from above, and the men on the walls watched. And no one called down to him because there was nothing to call. Then he stopped. He stopped the way a man stops when the running has completed whatever the running was for. He had given himself the time. He turned around and faced the direction Achilles was coming from, and he stood and he waited. The running had been necessary. It had let him arrive at the stopping with something the stopping required. He was afraid when he ran. He was still afraid when he stopped. But the stopping was chosen in a way the running had not been. And the choice was what mattered. Achilles slowed as he approached. They were close enough now to see each other's faces. This had not happened often. They had been on the same field many times and had seen each other across the distances that battlefields create. This was different. This was close. Hector spoke first. He said, "I want to make an agreement. If you kill me, you return my body to Troy. If I kill you, I will return yours to the Greeks. Let us fight with that understanding between us." Achilles said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "There are no agreements between us. We fight." This was not cruelty. Or not only cruelty. It was the statement of someone who had moved past the point where the forms and agreements and structures that governed how honorable men fought honorable wars had any meaning. Those things required a participation in the world's shared understanding that Achilles did not have right now. He had left it behind in a tent on the night Antilochus could not finish his sentence. They fought. It was not long. Hector was one of the best soldiers in the world, and he fought with everything he had. He was technically excellent, experienced, fighting on ground he had known for 10 years. He had advantages that should have counted for more than they counted for. The advantages did not count for enough. Achilles moved through the fight the way he moved through everything in these days, without the fraction of attention that even the best warriors spent on self-protection, not because he was careless, because that fraction was occupied by something else and was not available. He fought as though the possibility of being hurt was simply not a variable he was calculating. Hector's spear hit the new shield. The shield held. Achilles' spear found the gap between the neck of the breastplate and the helmet's edge, the place where Achilles himself knew this armor's limits, because he had worn it for 10 years and knew every weakness in it and had told Patroclus about them once, on a night that neither of them knew would matter the way it mattered. Hector went down. He did not go down all at once. There were a few seconds in which he was still present, still capable of looking up at the man standing over him and saying what he had to say. He said, "You will die at Troy. Paris and Apollo will see to it. Remember that I told you." Achilles looked down at him. He said, "I know. I will die here. I made that choice before you were a problem I had to solve." Hector looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "My body. Give my family my body." Achilles did not answer this. Hector died outside the walls of the city he spent his whole life defending. Achilles stood over him and felt nothing that resembled what he had expected to feel. That was the first sign that winning was not what he had thought it was. He tied Hector's ankles to the back of his chariot. This was done in front of the walls of Troy. He did not do it quickly or in the confusion of battle. He did it deliberately, with the specific intention that it be seen by the people on the wall above, by the Trojan soldiers watching from the gates, by everyone on both sides of this war who had eyes and was close enough to see. Priam saw it. He had watched the fight from above. He had watched his son run, and then stop, and then fight, and then fall. And the watching had the quality that people who have watched someone they love die from a distance have described across every culture and every era, the terrible combination of full presence and complete inability to intervene. He had been watching when Hector's body hit the ground, and he was watching now. He did not look away. Hecuba looked away. She turned her face from the wall, and the women around her turned with her and held her, and the sounds she made were the sounds of a thing breaking that had been holding together through an enormous effort for an enormous length of time, and had finally reached the limit of what it could hold. Priam stayed at the wall. He watched Achilles attach the body to the chariot. He watched the chariot begin to move. He watched his son's body dragged across the ground that Hector had defended for 10 years, through the dust of the field where Hector had fought more days than could be counted, past the place where the gates of Troy had opened every morning to let him out and closed every evening when he came back in. The gates did not open now. On the Greek side of the field, the soldiers watched in silence. Not the silence of approval, not the silence of celebration, the silence of men who are watching something they do not know how to respond to, something outside the categories they have for making sense of what happens on a battlefield. Diomedes, who had fought beside Achilles for 10 years and respected him more than he respected almost anyone, stood and watched and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said to the man beside him, "This is not war." The man beside him said he lost someone. Diomedes said, "I know what he lost." This is still not war. There was no answer to this that was adequate, and neither of them tried to find one. Achilles drove the chariot around the burial mound he had made for Patroclus. Around and around, the horses moving at the same steady pace, the body of Hector trailing behind, then before the walls themselves, so that the people who loved Hector could see what was being done to him. In Homer's poem, Apollo protected the body throughout all of this, despite everything Achilles did to it, despite the days of dragging and the heat and the dust. The body remained intact. A god who had argued for limits throughout the final weeks held those limits around the thing that Achilles was trying to destroy. Whether you understand this as divine mercy or as the story's refusal to let Hector be simply erased, the meaning is the same. Hector's body endured. It was still Hector when it was done. What came later depended on it. Achilles did not think about this. He was not thinking about what came later. He was not thinking in the way that involves future states and consequences and the requirements of other people. He was moving because moving was what was available to him, and stopping meant sitting with the thing he was moving to outrun. He did it the next day, and the day after. In the city above, Andromache had been told before she reached the wall. She had heard the sounds first, the specific quality of grief in the city that told her something had happened before anyone came to say what. She had gone to the wall and she had seen. She did not watch for long. She went back inside and found Astyanax, and she sat with him on the floor of a room in the palace, and she held him. He was 3 years old, and there was no explanation that was right for 3 years old. She held him, and she was very still, and he, sensing something in the stillness that required him to be still too, did not move or ask questions for a while. Outside, on the days when the wind was right, the sound of the chariot was audible from the palace. Inside, Andromache sat on the floor with her son and listened to it. On Olympus, or wherever it is that the gods watched from, there were conversations. Apollo argued for the body, for Hector, for the principle that certain things should not be permitted to continue indefinitely, regardless of the grief behind them. Zeus listened to all of it. He decided the body would be ransomed. Achilles would receive the old man. The old man would receive his son back. In the tent, Achilles sat alone. He had been alone for most of the days since Patroclus died. Alone in the specific way of people who are surrounded by others and allow none of them to reach them. The Myrmidons came and went. Food was brought and sometimes eaten. The rest of the time he was alone with what he was carrying. The greatest warrior in the world did this for days and found nothing at the end of it. The question is not whether what he did was wrong. The question is, what kind of grief turns a person into someone who does it anyway? The night was very dark. Not the darkness that comes when clouds cover the moon, but the darkness that comes from being past the point where fires are useful and before the point where morning begins to suggest itself at the edges of things. The middle darkness. The kind that makes distances uncertain and familiar paths feel longer than they are. Priam had been preparing since the decision was made. He gathered the ransom, the way a king gathers things that are needed, not thinking about cost, because cost was not the relevant category, thinking only about what was appropriate and what was enough. Gold, tripods, cauldrons, the finest cloth the palace had, things that in another context would have been called treasures. He loaded them onto a cart. His sons helped him, and he could see what it cost them to help. These were his living sons, the ones who had not gone out on the field today or on the days before. And they watched their father load a cart with the wealth of Troy to carry to the man who had killed their brother, and they could not say what they were feeling, because what they were feeling was too many things at once, and the things did not agree with each other. Hecuba said to him, "Do not go." This was not the first time she had said it. She had said it when he told her what he intended to do, and she had said it several times after in different forms. The same words, and then different words for the same thing. She was not a woman who repeated herself without reason. The repetition was the measure of how afraid she was. She said, "He is a lion. You are going to bring a ransom to a lion. Lions do not take ransoms." Priam said, "He will take this one." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "I do not know, but I am going anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. She had been married to this man for 50 years. She had watched him make decisions for 50 years. Good ones and bad ones, and ones that could not be fully evaluated until long after they were made. She knew the quality his face had when a decision was finished. When the arguing about it was over, even if the arguing was still happening in the room, his face had that quality now. She did not say anything else. She helped him with his cloak instead, adjusting it with the automatic care of someone who has been taking care of another person for so long that the care has become its own language, separate from whatever words are or are not being spoken. He climbed onto the cart. The god who guided him through the camp appeared in the way gods appeared in this world, not with announcement or spectacle, but as a presence that was suddenly there where it had not been. A young man who seemed to know the way, and who moved with the confidence of someone for whom darkness was not a problem. Priam followed. The cart moved through the Greek camp, with the particular invisibility of things that are impossible enough that the men around them do not process what they are seeing until after it has passed. A king of Troy. In the Greek camp, alone. At night, with a cart full of treasure. The sentries did not stop him. He reached the tent. He went in. Achilles was there with 2 of his men, Automedon and Alcimus, men who had been with him for the entire war and knew him well enough to read his moods before they fully formed. They had eaten recently. All the remains of eating were there. The tent had the quality of a place where time had been passing slowly, where the same thoughts had been occupying the same space for too long. Priam crossed the tent floor. He went to his knees in front of Achilles. He reached out and took Achilles' hands in both of his own. He held them there for a moment before he spoke. The hands of the man who had killed his son. He held them and felt them, the specific weight and texture of them. And he did not pull away. He had decided, somewhere before he arrived, that there could be nothing held back in this, that the thing he was doing required him to do it completely or not at all. Achilles looked down at him. He had not expected this. He had been told someone was coming, But the information had not prepared him for the sight of an old man on his knees on the floor of his tent, holding his hands, with the complete exposure of someone who has given up every protection except the truth of what they need. He went very still. Priam said, "Think of your father." He said it simply, without performance, in the way of a man who has reduced what he needs to say to its essential form, and is saying that form and nothing more. He said, "Your father, Peleus, is old, as I am old. He is home in Phthia, and he does not know today whether you are alive. But he has hope. He wakes in the morning and he has hope, because you are still in the world somewhere, even if he cannot see you. That hope is the thing keeping him alive. The way hope keeps old men alive, when everything else has left them." He paused. He said, "I had 50 sons when this war began. The best of them. The one who was the heart of everything. The one who every morning I watched go out through those gates, and every evening I watched come back through them. That one is lying in the dirt of your camp, because of your hands. And I am here in front of you asking for him back. I am kissing the hands that killed my son. Think of what it cost me to come here and do this. And then give me my son." The tent was absolutely quiet. Automedon and Alcimus had gone still in the specific way of men who understand they are in the presence of something that requires them to be invisible and are doing their best to be invisible. Achilles looked at the old man in front of him for a long moment. Then something happened in his face. Not a dramatic shift. Not a collapse. Something quieter. A change in the quality of what was there. The way light changes when a cloud moves. The same light and different. He thought about his father. He had not thought about his father. Really thought about him. In a long time. He had been too close to the center of his own situation to see anything outside it. He had been grief and then movement, and then the chariot, and the body, and the days of it. And none of that had had room in it for the specific image of an old man in Phthia who woke up every morning and had hope. The hope? He knew what that hope was made of. He had been told what his death would cost the people who loved him. He had been told by his mother, and he had understood it as information, and he had chosen what he chose anyway. Because on the beach at 9 years old, the glory had been more real to him than the future grief of people he loved. He had been 9 years old, and the grief had been abstract, and the glory had been vivid, and he had chosen the vivid thing. He was not 9 years old anymore. He started to cry. Not the way he had cried in the tent the night he heard about Patroclus. Not that sound. That thing too large for a human chest to contain. He cried the way a man cries when something has been locked up for a very long time and a specific key has arrived that he did not know he was waiting for. Quietly, and with the quality of something letting go rather than breaking. Priam was crying too. An old man and a young one, on opposite sides of a war that had been running for 10 years. In a tent, in the middle of the night, crying for different people. The old man for his son, the young man for his father, for Patroclus, for the version of himself that had sat on a beach and chosen this and had not known then what choosing it meant. They sat in it for a while. Neither of them tried to stop the other. After a time Achilles spoke. He said, "How many days do you need for the burial rites?" Priam said, 11 days. On the 12th, if the gods will, we will fight again. Achilles said, 11 days. He said it the way a man says something when it is settled, when the deciding is done, and he is just stating what the deciding has produced. He called for food and wine. He had Patroclus's serving women prepare a bed in another part of the tent for Priam, out of sight, because he understood without being told that if Agamemnon or any of the other Greek leaders knew that Priam was here, the situation would become something it did not need to become. He was protecting the old man, in his camp, in the middle of the night. He was protecting the man whose city he had spent 10 years besieging. Before Priam slept, Achilles came to where he was. He looked at him for a moment. the old man's face in the low light, the lines in it from the specific decades of being a father and a king in a city at war, the quality of exhaustion that was not only from the journey here. Achilles said, "Your son was a good man." Priam looked up at him. Achilles said, "I have been fighting him for 10 years. I know what I am talking about. He was a good man and he fought well, and he should not have had to do what he did for as long as he did it." Priam said, "No, he should not have." Achilles said, "None of this should have happened." Priam did not say anything to this. Achilles went back to his side of the tent. He lay down and looked at the roof, and outside the camp was quiet in the way. Camps are quiet at the deep part of the night. The fire's low, and the sentries making their rounds in the soft way of men who are tired and are pacing themselves toward morning. 2 men who had every reason to be enemies sat together in the dark and mourned. It was the most human thing that happened in 10 years of war. It happened too late to change anything. It happened anyway. Priam woke before Achilles did. He lay still for a moment, the way he had been lying still in the mornings for more years than he could easily count, the body coming back to itself slowly, the mind following after, the tent around him resolved out of the dark, the smells of it, wood smoke and oil, and the particular smell of military equipment. They were familiar in their type and foreign in their specific instance. He was in the tent of the man who had killed his son. He had slept. This surprised him. He had not expected to sleep. He had thought he would lie in the dark thinking about Hector and the wall and what he had watched from above. And instead, his body had made the decision it needed sleep and had taken it. The way bodies make these decisions independent of what the mind is occupied with. He thought about Hector, not the death. He had been thinking about the death for days, and he knew every angle of it by now. He thought about the life instead. He moved backward through it, the way you move through a house you are leaving for the last time, pausing in each room to take in what was there. Hector at 20, in the early years of the war, still with the quality of someone who had not yet been tested to his absolute limit and was curious about what that limit was. Already good. Already the best fighter Troy had by a significant margin, but still discovering what he was. Hector at 30, different in a way that was hard to specify exactly. The curiosity about his own limits had been replaced by something steadier. He knew them now. He had made his peace with the knowledge and was using what he had with a completeness that younger Hector had not managed. Hector, the morning Astyanax was born, standing in the corridor outside the room where Andromache was, unable to go in yet and unable to walk away. A man who had faced the full range of things a battlefield offered and who was visibly, completely undone by the sound of a baby crying. Priam allowed himself to smile at this in the dark of the tent. The smile did not last long, but it was real. Across the tent, Achilles was asleep. Priam looked at him in the low light. The breathing of a young man in deep sleep. The body doing nothing except existing. The specific defenselessness of sleep that had something almost confrontational about it given the circumstances. He was young. Priam had known this intellectually, had known the numbers of it, had been told and could have repeated that Achilles was a young man, that he had come to Troy young and had been here for 10 years. But the knowing had been abstract, the way things are abstract when they are about someone you have only seen at a distance or through the shape of their effect on the world around them. Up close, in the low light, he was young the way Hector had been young once. The face in sleep had a quality that the face in waking did not. The waking face of Achilles was almost not a face anymore, almost only a symbol of itself. The sleeping face was a young man's face. Priam looked at it for a while. He thought about what it had cost this person to do what he had done in the past weeks. He was thinking about the cost to Achilles, which was a different thing from the cost to Troy, and which he had not permitted himself to think about before, because the sympathy required to think about it had not been available. The young man had lost someone. He had lost someone who was the center of something for him. the person around whom the rest of it made sense. And the loss had done what certain losses do. It had taken out the floor. Everything that had been standing on that floor was still there. The strength and the skill and the decade of choices. But without the floor, it had nowhere to stand, and it had been moving through the world sideways, crashing into things, unable to find the ground. Priam had watched this from the wall. He had watched it with his dead son's body moving in the dust below, and he had not had the capacity to see it as anything except destruction. He could see it more fully now, in the quiet of the tent, with the destroyer asleep across from him. The destruction was real. The grief behind it was also real. Both things were true at the same time, and the truth of one did not diminish the truth of the other, and there was no resolution to this. No way to weigh them against each other that produced a clean answer. Priam had lived long enough to know that the situations which produced clean answers were rarer than the situations that did not. He got up quietly before the camp began to stir. He went to where his cart had been brought and organized what remained of the treasure he had brought. The pieces taken inside last night, with the careful movements of a man performing a task, because the task is there, and doing it is better than not doing it. Achilles came out before the horses were ready. He came out with the look of a man who has woken recently and is still becoming fully present in the morning. He looked at Priam. Priam looked at him. Between them, in the early morning light of the Greek camp, there was a quality of quiet that was different from other quiets. The quiet of men who have said what could be said and have arrived at the place that words point toward but cannot reach. Achilles helped with the horses. He did not announce this or frame it in any way. He simply came and put his hands on the work and did what needed to be done. Priam accepted this without comment. When the cart was ready and Hector's body had been carefully loaded and covered with the cloth brought for this purpose, Priam climbed up. He looked at Achilles standing below him. He said, "You will be remembered." Achilles said, "I know." Priam said, "I do not mean for the war. I do not mean for your fighting. I mean for last night. What you did last night. That will be remembered too." Achilles did not say anything to this. Priam looked at him for a moment longer, with the full weight of a long life seeing. Not judgment and not absolution. Just the complete attention of someone who wants to see clearly what is in front of them before it is no longer in front of them. He saw a young man who had been given extraordinary gifts and had used them to buy something whose price he had not understood when he agreed to pay it, and was only now beginning to understand, and who had months at most to live with that understanding before it came due. He saw a young man who might have been, in another life, a good man, who might have been the kind of man that the people around him could have built something alongside. He did not say any of this. He said, "Take care of yourself." Not the kind of thing kings say to enemy warriors in formal contexts. The kind of thing a person says to another person when they cannot say what they actually mean and settle for something smaller that contains the larger thing inside it. Achilles nodded. Priam drove the cart out of the Greek camp as the morning came fully into the world. The light was the particular light of early morning on the Aegean, horizontal and clear, the kind that makes things look the way they look when you are seeing them for the first time, or possibly the last time. The walls of Troy were visible ahead of him. He drove toward them. He did not look back. Achilles stood at the edge of his camp and watched the cart move away. He watched until it reached the gates. He watched the gates open. He watched the cart go through and the gates close. He stood there for a while after that, in the morning light, alone. He had won the war. He had lost Patroclus. He had spent days doing something that did not help. He had sat with an old man in the dark and cried for his father. He still did not know what any of it added up to. Neither do we. The Iliad ends with a funeral. Not Achilles' funeral. Hector's. Homer chose to stop there, with the Trojans mourning their greatest defender and the Greeks on the other side of the walls waiting for what came next. The poem that contains the most famous warrior in Western literature ends before that warrior dies. This was not an accident. Homer understood something about where the real ending was, and it was not the arrow. The story continued outside the poem. Later, traditions picked up where Homer stopped. Older threads and newer ones, woven together into accounts of what happened after the gates of Troy closed on Priam's cart, and Achilles stood alone in the morning watching them shut. What happened was the war continued. Wars do this. They continue past the moments that should end them, past the deaths that should be sufficient, past the points where everyone involved understands that the cost has exceeded anything the original purpose could justify. The war continued because the war was no longer about the reasons it had started. It had become its own reason. Achilles fought in it. He fought in the days after Priam's visit with the same physical capacity he had always had, and with something changed underneath it that the men around him felt but could not name. He was present in a way he had not been present in the weeks before. He was also not what he had been before any of it. He was a third thing. A man who had been somewhere and come back but had not come back to the same place he had left. He fought well. He was still the best soldier on the field. These facts did not change. What he was waiting for, though he would not have used the word waiting, was the thing his mother had told him was coming. He was not waiting with dread, with something closer to the specific patience of a man who has a debt he has been carrying for a long time and has accepted that it will be collected and is ready for the collection. Paris was on the wall. Paris, who had started this war, who had been fighting in it for 10 years, with abilities that were real, but that sat awkwardly alongside his brothers, who had the uncomfortable position of being the cause of the catastrophe without being equipped in the obvious ways to address it. Paris was a good archer. This was known and was not nothing. He did not fight the way Hector fought, in the middle of things, carrying the weight of everyone who depended on him. He fought at range, at angles, from positions that the men who fought in the traditional way of this war did not fully respect. Apollo was with him, the god who had protected Hector's body, who had argued for limits throughout the final weeks, was present at this moment in the way gods were present in Homer's world, not as spectacle but as the current that runs underneath events and sometimes decides which way they go, guiding the angle slightly, adjusting what was already going to be sent. The arrow found the heel. The story of the heel. Thetis, lowering her infant son into the river Styx and holding him by the ankle. The water, making every other part of him impossible to destroy and leaving that one spot untouched, does not appear in Homer. It comes from later mythographers and Roman retellings, building backward from the fact of the death to an explanation for how such a death was possible. If this man could not be killed, then his death required an explanation. The heel became that explanation. Whether the story is literally true does not change what it means, because the heel is perfect, as an image for what killed Achilles. The heel is more accurate than any purely factual account could be, not because it identifies a spot on his body that armor failed to cover, because it identifies the structure of his life. He had been protected in almost every way a person could be protected, trained beyond what training usually produced, gifted beyond what gifts usually provided, loved by a goddess with the full and helpless love of a mother who knew the end of the story and tried everything to change it, given the most remarkable equipment that the best craftsman in existence could produce, surrounded by men who would die for him, and had. The thing that killed him was not a failure of any of this. It was simply the thing that was always going to be there. The place his mother's hand was holding when the rest of him went into the water. The place that Chiron could not reach with any lesson. The place that all of it, the armor and the gifts and the decade of winning, had been arranged around without ever addressing. His real heel was not on his body. It was the part of him that needed to be loved, needed to be seen, needed to matter to someone specific and not just to history. Patroclus had been that. When Patroclus died, that part of him was exposed in a way that no armor Hephaestus could forge was ever going to cover. The arrow found it. He had time, the way traditions give their heroes time at the end. A breath between the wound and the darkness. And what he used it for was not a speech. He had made speeches. He had made arguments and declarations and statements of intent that armies had organized themselves around. He did not make another one. He lay on the ground of Troy and looked at the sky. The sky above Troy was the same sky that was above Thea. He knew this and had known it, but had not thought about it in a long time. The same stars that Chiron had taught him to read on the mountain. The same sun that had been coming up over the same sea every morning of his life. He had traveled very far to look at the same sky. He thought about the beach in Thessaly, his mother beside him, the water coming in cold off the Aegean, the question she had put to him in the careful way of a person trying to give someone a real choice, the silence before he answered, the way he had felt in that silence, the pull of one thing and then the pull of the other. And the pull of one had been so much stronger that the deciding had not really felt like deciding. He thought about whether he would choose differently. He did not know. He was not sure the question had an answer. He closed his eyes. Troy would not fall that day. It would fall later. Not because Achilles broke it open, but through another kind of power entirely. Through cunning and deception and a wooden horse left outside the gates, like a gift. Achilles would not see it. He had paid for his place in this story already. In the currency he had agreed to pay in on a beach before he understood what currency meant. The beach at Troy went quiet. 3,000 years later we are still saying his name. Thetis lost her son. Priam lost his son. Andromache lost her husband. Patroclus lost his life. Achilles got what he asked for. The beach at Troy is empty now. The ships are long gone. The war ended the way wars end. Not cleanly, and not with resolution, but with the eventual exhaustion of the people fighting it, and the slow return of survivors to places that were no longer quite the places they had left. Somewhere under 3,000 years of silence. Achilles is getting exactly what he asked for. Every generation that has ever lived has known his name. The trade paid out on both sides. The short life and the long memory both delivered as agreed. Whether that was worth it is the question this story has been asking since a boy sat on a beach in Thessaly and looked at the water and felt. In the pull of two futures, one pulling harder than the other. The question does not have an answer. It is still asking,